Welcome to the Carr Center. My name is Sharmila Murthy. I am a fellow here, and although my work now focuses mainly at the intersection of human rights and environmental issues, specifically access to water and sanitation, in a prior life, I spent a lot of time thinking about immigrant and refugee rights. And when I, through a colleague, had heard about Daniel Kanstroom's new book, Aftermath, Deportation Law in the New American Diaspora, was very eager to invite him to the Carr Center to come speak. And what we'll do first is actually just go around and do introductions, and then after that I'll introduce Dan, and then we'll take it from there. So, do you want to?
Hi, I'm Natalie. I actually work at the County School in the Environment and Natural Resources program, and I'm also a student at Diaspora.
I'm Anjali Fleury, a Master of Public Policy student here, and my interest is in migration and development.
I'm Brent Dance, a dual degree MBA and PA.
Yeah, I'm Tyson, an MPP1 student. I'm interested in environmental and energy policies, but I'm also interested in this topic.
My name
So I
is
want somebody to say they're just here, they're not interested in this topic, but they had a free minute.
I might be getting a little bit closer to that. My name is Dali Porn. I am an MPP student, and I've spent the last 4 years working on immigration reform, bringing coalitions together from high-level stakeholders across the country. But I'm not sure I'm returning to that. So
You had enough.
maybe.
Yeah, but it's about to get better.
I know. I know.
You worked in a bad time. Now
Now I'm in
you
school.
start
It's
working in a good time.
unfortunate.
I'm Sharon Weinblum. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Carr Center, and I work on migrant workers and asylum seekers in Israel. So,
Wait, with which organization?
the Carr Center for Human Rights, right here.
In Israel?
No, here the.
No, but when you do the work in Israel.
Oh,
are you
no,
affiliated with-
I'm
I asked
actually-
because I'm sending a student to work with an organization.
Oh, okay. I'm not working for an organization in Israel. I'm studying the organizations in Israel, basically.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. So
Well, maybe I should put you in touch
Yeah,
with my
actually,
student.
yeah.
I have
Sure.
a former student who's working on it. Anyway,
Oh, yeah,
we'll talk
yeah.
about it. Sorry.
I'm Joe Salvante. I recently graduated as a mid-career MPA in 2012, and I just ran for U.S. Congress, unsuccessfully, I might add.
Sorry.
So I'm here to sort of rediscover my new direction.
Good for you for running, though.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Who was the other bum?
He won. He was the incumbent. So maps 8th district here, not Cambridge, but across the river.
Oh,
against
hey.
against Stephen Lynch.
Stephen Lynch was my student.
Yeah, he graduated here too, 1999, I think, was it?
From Boston College.
Oh, from the law school.
He was a law school, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, not that we're close or anything.
Fair enough.
I haven't talked to him in 20 years.
Juan Salazar, also an MVP1 here at the Kennedy School. And I'm interested in migration and also workforce development.
Christina Flentes, MPP1 here and concurrent at Berkeley Law.
Great. So let me introduce formally Daniel Kanstroom, who is a professor of law at the Boston College School of Law and directs there the International Human Rights Program, is an associate director of the Boston College Center for Human Rights and International Justice, and also founded and directs the Boston College Immigration and Asylum Clinic. And I think has really just been a force in the world of immigration reform and deportation, and both by reading his profile and even the chance to talk with him for a few minutes before the session started, realized that he's really on the cutting edge of thinking about pushing legal theory to how we should be thinking about people who are caught up in the immigration system, and specifically deportees, and what happens to them when they're caught up in the system and what happens afterwards. And he's the author of a couple of books, originally Deportation Nation, Outsiders in American History, and most recently, Aftermath, Deportation Law and the New American Diaspora. And I should note that if you look at the reviews, not only does he have very great reviews from our own Jackie Baba here at the Kennedy School, but also from Ashley Judd, the actress and activist. So,
Who was here at the Kennedy School?
Who was here at the Kennedy School, yes, as well. So with that, it's a great pleasure to have you here, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. So my question is, which of you is going to blurb the next book, I guess. We'll see how that develops. It's a pleasure to be here. It's tricky to talk about these things in a group where I don't exactly know what you need to know. And the best advice I ever got when I went into teaching was that teaching should be about what students need to know rather than about what you happen to know. But I guess I'm going to talk about some things that I happen to know and try to frame some things that people talk a lot about, but I think that they have trouble thinking systematically about. And in light of the recent election results, I think this is a particularly important time to think about the issue of deportation, which tends to go under the radar, oddly enough, in a lot of the discussions, or at least confusingly around the side of the radar in a lot of the discussions about comprehensive immigration reform. I'm going to use a PowerPoint. I often quote a colleague of mine, Hiroshi Matamura, for the proposition that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But I'm going to ask you to bear with me because it helps to organize some of the talk. I guess I'll talk for about maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and that'll give us a good amount of time to take questions, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about this. Deportation is a big and complicated subject, and as you heard, I wrote a book a few years ago in which I referred to the United States as a deportation nation, but that title is a little bit misleading because the thesis of that book was not that we should redefine the classic nation of immigrants idea as a deportation nation, but rather that there's always been this separate stream of deportation that has paralleled, and the metaphor could be above or below or side, paralleled the nation of immigrants idea, that it was always there. And I'll tell you in a little more detail as I go forward how much it was always there. But when I talk about this book and the current reality, I do think it's important to say that my basic framing is that the United States is a nation of immigrants. It's an empirical fact. It's an aspiration. It's also a kind of national mythological fact in the sense that that is how we define ourselves as a nation state. In terms of the empirical aspect of it, we have well over 100 million non-immigrants coming in each year, actually closer to 200 million in most years, if you count students and people, tourists and workers and a wide variety of people, including people who come without visas from many countries. Very open and quite desirable as a destination to non-immigrants who are defined by law as people who are coming for a defined purpose for a temporary period of time, although some of them benefit from a doctrine that's known as dual intent. There may be people in this room who have H visas, for example, where you can come and say, I'm going to be here for 5 or 6 years, but if the stars line up right, I might want to stay. You can do that in some non-immigrant categories, but in most you can't. We also take in about 1 million lawful permanent residents per year, green card holders. That is an open and, to my mind, rather generous policy by historical standards and by comparative standards. If you look at other countries in the world, the lawful permanent resident population is quite large in this country, tens of millions. Naturalization in this country, the process by which a person becomes a citizen after having a green card. I have spent a lot of my career critiquing aspects of that system, but I have to say on the whole, again, if you can look at it historically and comparatively, relatively open, relatively easy, relatively generous. If you compare it to countries like Japan, for example, quite open, quite easy, quite generous. And even historically, in this country, there were racial prohibitions against naturalization until the mid-20th century. We don't have any of that anymore. You do have to learn to speak English. You have to take a test. The fees are too high. In my view, there are some securitization issues. But still, on the whole, I think it fits the nation of immigrants idea pretty well. And we have a relatively decent refugee and asylum policy. On the refugee front, we take in about 80,000 or more refugees per year, which is, again, to my mind, not a sufficient number, but reasonable minds can differ about what's sufficient. And by comparative standards, relatively generous, relatively open, relatively well structured. They get some benefits. Again, it's not perfect. Asylum has been improved dramatically in my professional lifetime. There's now a professional cohort of asylum officers who adjudicate these claims. There's a relatively well-structured administrative and judicial review system. So that all seems very nice, and in many ways it is. And I think it's important to not forget that, particularly for somebody like me who's predominantly a critic and pretty much everything I'm going to say after this is going to be critical, so I thought it might be good to start off with some positives. This is what we do in like student-teacher sessions also. First you start with the positives, then you say, but there's this thing. The aspirational part, the national mythology of being a nation of immigrants, I think it's very important not to trivialize that. There's a lot of scholarly debate about that, but to my mind, the best way to appreciate it is to compare it with other national mythologies. You could have a national mythology that is religiously based or ethnically based. Israel is a very good example of a country that has a mix of those two things. Germany has a sort of ethno-cultural conception of the nation state. It's only recently that the German government stopped saying officially in its pronouncements that they said, "Wir sind kein Einwanderungsland," we're not a nation of immigrants, positively rejecting the idea of immigration. So the implications of this, I think, are enormous if you think about it. The implications of being a nation of immigrants as a national mythology are implications of dynamism, openness, diversity, cultural pluralism, a lot of things that I at least consider to be quite positive and worth cherishing and nurturing. But, as Marshall McLuhan once said, sorry, we skipped a slide here somehow. I don't know who discovered water, but I know that it wasn't a fish. And the point of my work has been to tell people that we've been swimming in the water of deportation in this country for the last 20 years in ways that are profoundly radical, harsh, and I will argue divergent from our best traditions as a nation of immigrants. And most people don't know it. And it is really quite remarkable when I give public talks about this subject, how few people, except the people who experience it personally, invariably at any public speech I give, there's often some person who is undocumented who will come, or somebody who knows somebody who has faced deportation. And those people feel it acutely, profoundly, painfully. But that's a minority. It's a small minority. It is really not on the radar screen of national debate. And even the Obama administration, which in many respects I support, I'll just say, put it on the table, and worked with during the transition, has taken some, I think, very wrong turns on this and has ignored a reality. And the reality is that we are in the midst of a massive social experiment for the past 20 years or so that, as I say, is harsh and radical by any historical measure, and I did write that book, Deportation Nation, to explain the roots of the deportation system and where it all came from and why and how it developed. But we have never seen anything even remotely like this, and nor has any other country in the history of the world actually seen it, an immigration control system of the size and the ferocity and the scope that has been built, ironically, in a nation of immigrants. So that's a problem to think through. How do you relate those two things to each other? Now, when most people think about the immigration debate these days, sorry, I keep skipping one, I don't know why. Why does that happen? Let's see. We want to go to the next slide. Maybe if I just say it out loud, that would this is how superstition develops. Now we're not getting anywhere. Let's try it the old-fashioned way. Better. No, but that's not the next slide. Well, I had a slide there, we'll just skip that, that showed pictures of the dreamers in Chicago. Here's the picture of the slide. You know, you saw tens of thousands of people lining up for this government benefit in Chicago, and it was quite moving to me. I mean, it actually very moving to see all of these young people, the best and the brightest of the undocumented population. This is what, when people think about deportation, they think about them, I think, now. That's what people are talking about. That's what the administration has been focusing on. And of course, that's a wonderful group of people, amazing group of people. But when others think about illegal aliens, they tend to think about something more like this. And so there's this dissonance. I mean, you have and this is part of what I want to critique the administration for, this positioning of the good immigrants and the bad immigrants. And I think there still is in many people's mind, if you use the term illegal alien, it's this idea of the bad immigrant. And part of that is terminology. Alien does have this extraterrestrial connotation. In English, in other languages, you could find words that are not extraterrestrial, at least, you know, Ausländer in German, or sans-papier even in French, which I think is even better, which means just without papers, undocumented. But in English, we tend to have this alien thing, and also we tend to do a peculiar move that is very jarring to the ear of a law professor, which is to take this adjective, illegal, which is normally the end product of a specific, highly structured forensic process. It's a question about conduct. Was the act that a person did legal or illegal? And in the criminal realm, we have very heavy protections. The government has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant doesn't have to speak. They have a right to a jury trial, all kinds of things. And then at the end, you don't even then say the person is illegal. You say the conduct was illegal and the person must face punishment for the conduct that he or she did. It's a very different thing to call a person in his or her essence illegal. Now, I understand why we do that, because the person has crossed the border and doesn't have the authorization to be here. Nevertheless, given that we're not only a nation of immigrants, but a nation of laws, as Tocqueville wrote about centuries ago, and I think it's still true, this epithet has a real sting to it, and I think the dreamers feel it, and all people in removal feel it. But that's not even the part of deportation that I want to focus your attention on, because there's a whole other part that people are not talking about at all. So this was a client of mine from about 9 years ago now, named Edna Borges, who was from Cape Verde, and there's a lot of Cape Verdeans around here. She had come to this country when she was a baby, age of 2, and was legal, had a green card, was a lawful permanent resident. As a teenager, she got into some trouble. She got caught shoplifting a small amount of goods, and she got caught with pepper spray. In the criminal justice system, I'm not encouraging this behavior, but I used to run our criminal defense program. That is nothing compared to what most people in, let's say, Dorchester District Court end up, getting charged with. And so she did there was no jail time. She was given a suspended sentence. Petty larceny was the formal charge for that, as it turned out. And yet that had immigration consequences. And so for some period of time, she had to check in with immigration authorities on a regular basis. But one day during her check-in, they suddenly told her that they had changed the process and they were going to arrest her on the spot. And she was going to be held with no possibility of bail. And she said, well, when can I see a judge? And they said, well, your hearing date will be approximately 15 months from now. She had gone in that day with her 8-day-old baby who she was breastfeeding, and the baby was separated from her, and the federal authorities said, you're going to have to call a grandmother or somebody to come and get this baby because you are subject to mandatory detention. And that was all correct under the law. This wasn't some random act of cruelty. They were enforcing the law as the Congress passed it. Now, as it happened, we managed to get her out more quickly through our clinical program, but that's the rare part, because this happens tens of thousands of times per year in this country and has been happening for the last 20 years because of changes that were made to the deportation laws. And this is largely an understood and untold story. And what I'm trying to write about is to get people to understand, why did the laws get to be like that? And do we really want laws like that? What have the goals of that system been, and what have the consequences of it been? And again, I can only give you a flavor of it today, but in the book I talk about a lot of different examples of this. Some of the most poignant have been young men from Cambodia who for years thought they were not going to face deportation at all because there was no treaty between the United States and Cambodia, so Cambodia wouldn't take them. But in the meantime, they grew up here. Often these are children who were carried by their mothers from the killing fields of Cambodia, that generation. And then they grew up, often got into trouble with the criminal justice. They were also legal. They had come as refugees. They would have green cards, but many of them never became citizens. Sometimes because they couldn't, but in the more poignant cases, because their mothers, it's typically their mothers, it's typically men with mothers, fathers didn't get out. They didn't know. They thought that having a green card was the same as being a citizen. They had no idea that they could get deported, and then they would get some criminal involvement, often drugs, sometimes serious things, many cases not serious things. Again, to my mind, possession of drugs is not a serious thing in the way of justifying banishment for life, which is what happens to them. And then they find themselves in Cambodia, where they don't speak the language, they have no contacts, they have no job prospects, they have no possibility of ever seeing their parents or their mother in this country again, or children that many of them have, because they are banished for life. And So I try to tell their stories in a variety of ways, and I'll skip over the next slide just in the interest of time. But in the book I tell some of these stories. But I try to also explain in the book, as I was saying before, that this is not a new problem in the nation of immigrants. This is a quotation from George Washington from 1783. He's speaking to a group of Irish immigrants. And the first part is very classic. You can find statements like this from Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and all kinds of people. The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions. That was an incredibly amazing thing to say in 1783. That is the American ideal. And I feel very strongly, as I said at the outset, that that's a very important thing to cherish and remember. He said, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges. In fact, that little phrase, whom we shall welcome, was taken from this quotation and became the title, the caption, the name of a presidential commission study about immigration in 1951. But it's the second part, the end clause, that people have not focused on and that I'm trying to focus on. If, by decency and propriety of conduct, they appear to merit the enjoyment. What does that mean? Again, to a lawyer's eye, that raises a lot of questions. Who decides what's decent? Who determines, and through what process? What is propriety of conduct? What does it mean to merit the enjoyment of the United States? And who gets to say that you don't? Is it a jury? Is it a judge? Is it a border patrol agent? Is it some mix? Is it a local cop on the street? Well, as it stands now, it's all of those in a very confusing melange. So that raises the question of how we should theorize deportation. And many people have, many people have not written about this. I was going to say many people have written about it. A rising number of people are writing about it now, and I don't want to take all the credit for that, but I will say that what I've been trying to do is get people to conceptualize deportation as a field of study, as an area of inquiry. And there are a lot more people now getting PhDs in Europe in particular, but also in the United States. There's a lot more law professors writing about it. When I started practicing in this field, it was rare to find any law school that had anybody on the full-time faculty who taught immigration law. Now you would be hard-pressed to find a law school that doesn't have two people teaching immigration law, typically one in a clinic and one on the, what we call the podium or doctrinal faculty. And yet, there's a lot of thinking that is worth doing about this. The people at Oxford have been doing some great theoretical work, and there's a lot of other people I can mention. But basically, most people tend to think of deportation as either border control or demography control. And by border control, it's essentially, it's the stopgap mechanism that we have to catch people who evade the primary control of the border. So this I call extended border control. And I personally am very interested in legitimacy theory, and I would, tie it to sort of a Habermasian idea of trying to find the relationship between laws and legitimacy. Extended border control, it seems to me, is legitimate if you accept the basic proposition of a nation state, which not everybody does, but I do. We can discuss that. I'd be happy to about why I do. But if you accept the nation state, it seems to me that you have to accept some form of extended border control deportation. Now, we could have profound disagreements about things like, should there be a statute of limitations after which a person shouldn't get deported? Should we not deport people to torture, or refugees, or what if they have families? How should we do it? But those are second-order questions. I'm suggesting that the fundamental legitimacy of the system is very directly related to the nation state. Now, the other form of deportation, I'll skip over labor market regulation because that's a confounding problem with extended border control as it's worked in this country, that it actually serves more as labor market regulation than it does as border control, but I'll come back to that in a minute. The other form, though, the form that affected Edna and the Cambodians, is a very different kind of an animal, and that I call post-entry social control. This arose later in the game. This is largely a 20th century phenomenon, and it started off really small. It was an idea about prostitutes originally and then drug dealers, but it has risen and it has grown. And now, I'll show you some statistics, but according to the government statistics, they're deporting about 200,000 people per year who are otherwise legal for criminal, and not only criminal conduct. You can get deported for having donated money to a Hezbollah-affiliated charity. You can get deported for all kinds of political reasons as well, but most of it is criminal. And I think the legitimacy line on that is much more complicated, and I've wondered about it, and I'm not convinced about why we do it, because fundamentally, to cut to the chase, it seems to me that basically it's double punishment. Just to be clear about this, what happens to a person is they get prosecuted in the criminal justice system, they serve whatever sentence has been handed out in the criminal justice system, then a detainer gets put on them, and then they face deportation proceedings. So both things happen, not one or the other. And so what's the justification for it? I think there are basically two. One is crime control. People say they are criminals and they should be punished, and of course that argument works well, but it's very simplistic. We have to ask questions. I say in the book, the assertion that laws have been broken, like some people say, well, they broke the law, period. And in the book I say, to my mind, it should be they broke the law, question mark. Because the question is, okay, they broke the law, so then what should we do about it? That's a whole other set of questions that need to be thought about. And I'll tell you some sociological data in a minute about crime control. And others say it is just the rule of law if you violate the law. But of course, violating the law can never be a binary thing. We all violate laws. People have home offices, people speed, people litter, people spit on the sidewalks. So saying that a person has broken the law, and again, therefore they should be deported, is not a compelling argument to my ear. All right, I'm going to skip over Jefferson and Madison in the interest of time, other than only to say that they did have some interesting thoughts about this. My view of it is that deportation is best understood as an enforcement mechanism, and that it's about more than immigration status. It's a lot about race. It's a lot about various political constituencies, as you can see just from what's happening. I mean, look at Sean Hannity, look at what's happening after the election as people's perceptions are changing. So it's about a lot. The deportation system is highly anomalous. That is to say, it is really different from other areas of law. You cannot not be held without bail in the criminal justice system unless you are charged with murder or there's a specific finding in Massachusetts that you're a danger to the community, which has very specific guidelines. People, for example, in the immigration system are routinely held without bail. There are other anomalous aspects that I'll talk about more as we go forward. It challenges a lot of societal values, as I've said, not just the nation of immigrants idea, but I think the rule of law itself and basic human rights. And it has created this new American diaspora, which I want to mention only to say that there's whole fields of diaspora studies as well. In fact, we have this program at Boston College. We have an ongoing faculty seminar about it. So I use this term advisedly and humbly. Some people have said there's a diaspora because the term has been rendered meaningless because it's been so overused. But I think this is an interesting way to think about diaspora. Essentially, diaspora, comes from the Greek, the scattering of the seeds. Sorry, no, that's not working. Okay, there we go. A diaspora is essentially a forcibly displaced population that has maintained some sort of strong ties to what its people recognize as their original homeland. That's a crude, functional definition. The classic examples being the dispersion of the Jews. Also, there's an Armenian diaspora that people could talk about. Various things, typically an ethnic or religious group that has a homeland. Deportation is different because although they do have this identity based on upbringing, socialization, culture, and family connections, they are Americans. And I can tell you how much Americans they are. I mean, I've been traveling the world interviewing deportees, and I just had a very striking, about a little more than a year ago, I was talking to some deportees in the Azores. And there's a lot of Azorians in New England. I don't know if people know that, but it's a population from Portugal, and they're all post-entry social patrol deportations, almost all men, almost all in their 40s, 50s, like that, typically with drug or alcohol problems that have resulted in their deportation. These guys are Americans. I mean, you talk to them, you're hanging out in Somerville when you talk to them. And here I am in the Azores, and I'm interviewing them as deportees, as I had done with Guatemalans, and I say to one of them, so, what was deportation like for you? He says, well, to tell you the truth, it freaking sucks. And I'm thinking, well, that's pretty American. You know, like that's how an American would put it. See, I'm an American. But he's not an American because he doesn't have formal citizenship status. And as the law stands, he will never be able to come back to America. So I use this term diaspora to make this provocative claim that we have a forcibly uprooted population of people who have deep, cohesive social and cultural connections to each other and to the United States, and yet they are not here anymore. They have been forcibly deported. And as I said, deportation can affect anybody. So the deportation system is big. I think I said that early on, and that raises a question of how should we measure it. And I'm going to skip over one slide here, but to measure it this way, how many foreign-born people are there in the United States? About 38 million, 21 million in legal immigration status, but as you now know, they too face deportation. About 160 million new non-immigrants on average per year, and 1 million legals, about 11 to 12 million illegal, undocumented. I challenge my students to come up with a better phrase. They came up with the documentarily challenged, so you can use that if you like. But people without papers, undocumented, all potentially subject to deportation. So you can measure the size of a system by the scope of the population that it governs. This is a large population. I mean, this is larger than most countries in the world. And for these people, I can tell you from personal experience and research, deportation is the primary part of the rule of law that they have to be most concerned about. But if they come into my office or if I talk to them, I advise them a lot of different things that they do to avoid running afoul of this system, including some very esoteric things about traveling and how long you can be out and in. But there's actually a better way to measure it, which is how often does it happen? So here's a rather striking statistic. 35 million times since 1980 has there been an encounter between government agents and an individual, pursuant to which the individual was ordered to leave the United States. Now that includes a wide variety of mechanisms, some very close to the border, some at or near airports, but also millions, many millions, tens of millions of interior deportations. We're up around 400,000 per year and have been with this administration. Formal deportations, that's with processes, formal legal process. But if you count all these mechanisms, it's over 1 million per year, and it has been for quite some time. So that's a big system, I think, by any measure. I can tell you something about the budget of it in a minute, and this is the latest statistics from ICE, so I'm not getting this from NGOs. This is the government. 641,000 apprehensions in fiscal year 2011. 429,000 detentions over the course of the year. So divide that by days in the year, and you can see how many people are in detention. Now it's actually more than that number. It's usually about 30,000 at any given time. This is interesting. Now they say that they have 188,000 known criminal aliens removed. So who are those people? Criminal aliens, you would think, would be a person you wouldn't want to be living next to in your neighborhood. Probably. It sounds pretty awful. And if you go to the ICE website, although it's been toned down a little bit recently, used to be you would see these really horrible, like pedophiles and rapists, and there definitely are some of those. But it turns out that almost 70% are drugs, and most typically possessory drug offenses, traffic offenses, and now immigration-related crimes. So that people who formerly would have been simply civilly deported are now criminally prosecuted, then deported, then counted in the statistics of known criminal aliens removed. So that's an interesting fact that we can come back to in terms of data. But the basic point is that the population against whom this post-entry social control mechanism has been deployed is an ever more minor array of crimes. And yet, there's no statute of limitations on a lot of these things. So people are I had a guy who got stopped for a 30-year-old shoplifting case that they happened to find that happened to him in North Carolina when he was a graduate student.
What is a return?
Well, removals are the formal process. Returns are what they call involuntary departures, or people caught near the border through other mechanisms. But functionally, it's the same fact of a person. They might be offered a bus ticket, or they could do it voluntarily, but they have to leave.
So, one question about the 66% statistic. So if a lot of states now criminalizing driving license? So did that then move from being what was once a traffic offense to now
No, that
immigration-related crime?
driving without a license will not result in deportation. Drunk driving would. Leaving the scene of an accident would. Recidivist driving without a license might, but I don't think so. So
But if it's
typically,
criminalized.
yeah, but see, it's a confusing interaction between the state. It has to be a state crime, but it also has to be on the federal list of deportable offenses. And this I spent a whole semester, which you're welcome anytime to come. But not all crimes will result in deportation. But possession of marijuana will. Possession of any controlled substance will. And a lot of driving offenses will. Reckless driving might. But typically driving with, now what happens with driving without a license, a lot of people think they got deported. A lot of Guatemalans told me that they were deported for driving without a license. No, they were arrested for driving without a license because of differential enforcement practices in Maine and Framingham and other places, but they were out of status. And so once they came to the attention of the system, there's much more harmony now than there used to be. And so anybody who ends up in the criminal justice system is now much more likely than had been the case in the past to then be funneled into the immigration system. But I'm happy to talk more about that. Let me just wrap this part up and then I have so much to say. You know, it's like John Updike said, you ever wonder why most people are so boring and the rest of us are so fascinating? And again, this thing is sticky. All right, so does it work? The answer seems to be, oddly enough, no. I mean, there's been a fair amount of research now. Doug Massey at Princeton and Wayne Cornelius and others have tried to measure, does even extended border control deportation work to reduce the size of the undocumented population? And compared to economic factors, it seems to be actually quite trivial. Of course, you would say there are people who are not here now who would have been here, except the problem is that many of those people come back again and again and again. Why do they do that? Because they're driven here by desperate poverty. And when I interviewed people in Guatemala and said to them, what would it take as a sanction to make you not come back again? Most of them said, I can't even imagine what it would be, because if I don't try again, my mother has borrowed $15,000 from the mafia in order to hire a coyote to help me across the border. That we have to pay that back. People from China, it's even worse, the amount of money, but it's harder, of course, to come back again and again from there. They're desperate, and criminal prosecution, even criminal prosecution, doesn't seem to dissuade this population very much. And as I say, there's studies now that indicate that deportation doesn't. So that's about the extended border control deportation. Let's just say it's questionable if it's really accomplished very much, if anything. And the budget is around $17 billion per year for immigration enforcement. So if you ever do get elected, we might talk about whether, the constituents want to spend the money on that. There's a lot of debate about that between police. It could be going to other things. What about the crime stuff? The data there are even better. We know that about 1 million people have been deported from post-entry criminal conduct. As I said, some serious, some not, and a lot of it not. What has it done for crime rates? Well, sociologists have studied that phenomenon, and they have concluded not much, very little. First of all, as I say, the vast majority for marijuana. Ruben Rambau, who I was just visiting with at UC Irvine, is probably the leading sociologist on this question. The single best predictor of criminality in life is gender, first of all. So if you want to target criminal enforcement resources, target men. That's number one, but leaving that aside, the second biggest predictor of criminality is citizenship status. It turns out that citizens are much more likely to commit crimes than non-citizens, which raises an interesting question of, should we be devoting criminal enforcement resources to the immigrant community? And sociologists are saying, no, it doesn't seem to make any sense. He says if there was an immigrant crime problem, in quotes, it was not found among the immigrants, but among their U.S.-born sons. Now that could be a social problem, but the solution for it is not deportation, because you can't deport the U.S.-born sons of immigrants. So we can talk about how we should address that. Meanwhile, how does this system work? I'll wrap up with this: mandatory detention, no right to counsel. If you face deportation proceedings and you cannot afford a lawyer, you don't get one. And the statistics are stunning as to how much better people with lawyers do than people without lawyers. Still, you can't get one. minimal Fourth Amendment rights. Government agents have vastly superior authority to break into homes, to seize documents, to use those documents in courts if it's a deportation proceeding. That's part of the reason why this was so seductive for the government to use post-September 11, when there was a rise of various types of deportations after that. By the way, how many terrorists actually got deported? Although there were tens of thousands of young men who were removed, how many actual terrorists were caught as a result of deportation? According to David Cole, who has studied it, the answer is 0, or maybe 1. So it turns out it was not a very effective system in terms of actual terrorist fighting, but it's a lot easier than prosecuting people criminally, so it's tempting for the government to use. It's retroactive. This is also kind of weird from a law perspective, but you can actually be deported for something that was not a deportable offense when you did it. So this is the idea of it being civil and not criminal, and it makes it very hard for people to know, are we safe or not, but it has a tremendous chilling effect on immigrant communities, particularly in terms of political organizing and rights advocacy and various other things. Selective prosecution can be used. People can be selected for deportation in ways that they could not be selected in the criminal justice system. No jury trial, newly restricted administrative and judicial review, and this is the thing that I'm working on now most energetically. We now know that many, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people have been wrongly deported. Why is that? Because for 15 years, government prosecutors were energetically deporting people pursuant to theories that were then rejected by the Supreme Court in a series of cases over the last 5 years or so. And not by the liberal justices, by the way. These were 8-1, 9-0 decisions. One of the first ones was written by Justice Rehnquist, who was a famous conservative. And yet, we get emails and calls in our program. Now, I have an attorney who works with me on these cases. We get calls from Guatemala, from Honduras. We just got a call from Honduras recently of people who say, wait a minute, I just read that Supreme Court decision that said that simple possession of, in this client's case, he had possessed ecstasy, that's not actually an aggravated felony. My brother just sent me this. That means I shouldn't have been deported, right? And we write back and say, yeah, that's true, you shouldn't have been deported. And then he says, well, can we reopen this case? And then we say no, because there has been this rule that once you are out, the government gets to wash its hands of you, and you cannot reopen this case. So we've been litigating this in every circuit around the country and have been winning it, but still it's a long, hard slog for various reasons. And even if we win this basic issue, it's very hard to bring these motions. So there's a lot of people who really shouldn't have been deported in the first place, is the bottom line, a very large number. Maybe I'll stop there. Sorry, there's one other thing I want to get to, which is what it's like out there.
You can come back to this maybe after.
Yeah. But I just want to make sure we have time to talk. This is the project that I was talking about, the Ruby Slippers Project. I first called it the Ruby Slippers Project because of the movie The Wizard of Oz and Click in the Heels, No Place Like Home. So you'll probably appreciate this as a human rights branding story. So much of human rights work is about marketing and branding, getting people to resonate. So I thought Ruby Slippers, that's terrific, right? And we had these mugs from the Judy Garland Museum, and I was giving out little ruby slippers to the people who I work with. And then we went up to the Cambodian community in Lowell, Massachusetts, where a lot of the people don't speak English. And they translated the name of the project to them as the Red Shoes Project. And they all thought that meant we were a communist organization, and nobody would talk to us. So we had to change the name of the project, and that's why it's now called the Post-Deportation Human Rights Project. But what I wanted to say is that there is this, this diaspora out there, and I have seen it all over the world. In Haiti, for example, it is dreadful. People are arrested, they've been held in terrible prison conditions with a lot of disease, a lot of corruption, beatings. In the Dominican Republic, in El Salvador, in Cambodia, it's been similar. The Azores is actually a better story in some ways. In fact, I've worked with the government of the Azores, and we're having a conference on Saturday where we're bringing some government people in. So there are some better models, but a lot of people, and the book is full of these kind of stories, have faced violence, mistreatment by the police, but mostly it's family separation and social ostracism that people talk about. In Jamaica, somebody said that deportees are so ostracized that when a car breaks down, they call it a deportee. Like anything that's broken is a deportee. In Cambodia, it's tremendous shame. In Guatemala, it's the same thing. These are the people who failed. And so they're depressed and they can't find jobs. Except, oddly enough, a lot of them find jobs in Central America. They find jobs in call centers. So when you're giving your credit card information to somebody and that person says, can I have your social, you may very well be talking to a deportee. In fact, it's quite likely that you are. So that's a little ironic thought, but there's not a lot of those kinds of things. I just always end with this point, which is a quote from Justice Murphy in 1945 in a case involving Harry Bridges, who was a famous labor organizer who the government pursued relentlessly for 30, 40 years and ultimately failed to deport. I tell his story in the first book. But lawyers talk about zealous advocacy, and I personally take that quite seriously, but I like the end point of this quotation as a counterpoint to the end point of George Washington's, which is that I don't do this work personally out of a sense of charity, or even really so much out of a sense of compassion. I do it more because I still have this maybe naive, many people think it's naive, idea about what this country should be in terms of how we treat the most humble, the most unorthodox, and the most despised among us. That's really the bottom line test of what kind of a country, what kind of a legal system you have. So I would say that I'm doing it, I think I'm doing it for us, all of us, not for them. And I try to get my students to think about it that way as well. Anyway, I'll stop talking now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. I think that was an excellent talk. And let me kick it off with one question, and then we'll open it up to you guys. So one thing that I thought was interesting that you didn't really talk about was race. And I know when you look at the history of immigration law, so even the letting people inside, if you look at the history, there's always been kind of a racial overlay. And I wonder if you could talk about that in this context.
I have a slide, which I won't go back. It was one of the ones I skipped over, that shows the percentage of foreign-born population. So this is the nation of immigrants part. The percentage of the foreign-born in this country is now at all-time highs, equivalent to roughly 1910. But in 1910, it was mostly Europeans who were coming. And there was, of course, a lot of debate about that. There was nativism, there were all sorts of issues. But there was essentially no deportation. So deportation has paralleled the change in the racial composition of the immigrant stream into the United States. And it's almost a perfect parallel. There is no question that we are admitting many more people of color now. This is, they're not coming from Western Europe very much. And I don't think it's a coincidence that deportation and the idea that certain people have to live perfect lives has come into being just at that same time. Also just at the same time, Mary Waters came to a book talk that I gave. She said, interestingly enough, the slope of that change also parallels felony disenfranchisement of African American men. And then somebody else came and did a talk at BC and said it also parallels changes in the juvenile justice system that are focused on young men of color. All of these things have been happening at the same time. It is definitely a highly racialized system. Now, does that mean that all ICE agents are racist? No, I mean, some of them are, but many of them are not. This is a big social phenomenon, but we gradually have gotten used to the idea that we can deport people for minor offenses, that they have to live, as I say, perfect lives. And the vast, vast majority, if you look at the top 10 countries of deportation, none of them are European countries. So I think it's very racialized. It's also racialized in the sense that the criminal justice system has been the primary conduit now into deportation, and that is a racialized system for all sorts of other social reasons. So I think race is a very important part of it, and I should probably talk more about it in the basic presentation, but I feel like there's so much to cover. Somebody always asks this question, and then I'm ready with that answer.
Yeah. And just one follow-up. The trend, that time, how long ago are we talking about when this trend really happened?
Okay, so the change in the immigration flow is roughly the mid-60s, and the development of the deportation system starts tentatively in the 70s, and then really picks up steam in the 80s, and then again much more in the 90s. The major legal change was a set of laws that were passed in 1996, and the major impetus for that, ironically in retrospect, was the Oklahoma City bombing, where the first reports were, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but the first reports were swarthy foreigners who were seen and thought that this was a terrorist act foreigners, by the time they got Timothy McVeigh and the other guy, these laws had already made it through as part of an omnibus bill that many of the people who voted for it now say they never read. It was too big. It was all part of the whole other thing. And many of the people who voted for it have now come out publicly and said they regretted it and they wouldn't have voted for it had they known. And many of them have constituents who they've tried to get special exemptions for. Some of the leaders of this have tried to get special exemptions, saying, well, yeah, I've supported the law, but this kid is my son-in-law, you know, something like that. So it's a brutal set of laws that I think have really changed the nature of the system. Of course, it's much easier to get these laws passed than it is to repeal them. I mean, try running for office saying, I support the rights of criminal aliens. You know, you can't win an election that way anytime. So it's a very difficult political sell, and that's why I said at the outset that I'm disappointed about the state of political discourse in this country. It's not that I don't understand why the Obama administration calls this smart enforcement, because they say we'll differentiate the good ones from the bad ones, we'll go after the bad ones. Well, that sells, and it makes a certain amount of sense unless you start getting into it and see who are we really deporting and what does this policy really mean on the ground. But that's a much more subtle argument to make. I can do it in an op-ed, I can do it in a book. I'm sure I couldn't run for office on that. So if you win election and then you want to repeal one of these laws, you face enormous headwinds as being soft on crime, and you know, then you live in fear that some non-citizen drunk driving kills somebody or rapes somebody. You know, things happen. I mean, and then you feel like your career could be over. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who have taken this issue seriously in the Congress over the years, but they've been a minority.
Great. Other questions?
Early on in our conversation, you mentioned sort of the momentum that's starting to gain towards comprehensive immigration reform. So given that there's going to be this momentum, to what extent do you think there's going to be any changes within the deportation system? I mean, I know there's going to be the whole process of potentially legalize the status of a lot of folks that are here and they're undocumented, but deportation is probably still going to be an issue.
I would bet my house and land that we're going to see some sort of comprehensive immigration reform bill fairly quickly. I base that on the fact that I know the president wants to get it done. I know a lot of people in the administration want to get it done. And now I'm hearing that the Republicans have recognized the demographic reality, their read of what happened in this election. By the way, as I'm sure you know, it's not that the Latino vote is uniform on this issue. I mean, it's a complicated reality. But in general, I think we'll see something. On the other hand, I should say, I was also one who was in Guatemala in summer of 2008 telling people, you know, there's this guy Obama running for president, and I think if he gets elected, it's really going to reform the immigration system, because he's a child of immigrants and he really gets it. So I was wrong about that, so I could be wrong about this. But I'll tell you what I'm not wrong about. There's nothing in any proposal about comprehensive immigration reform that I've seen that has anything to do with post-entry social control deportation or the criminal stuff. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The administration establishes its enforcement bona fides by cracking down more on the bad ones in order to get a deal for the dreamers. And I think if we see anything, that's what we're likely to see. So I think I'm going to be in business with this stuff for a while, because this is not changing anytime soon. Unless the courts step in, which is happening more and more. And that's been happening in Europe. Actually, the last chapter of the book, which I didn't talk about here, is about human rights law and about other ways that legal systems can conceptualize these things. And so there are ideas of proportionality that are tractable, real things, that you could overturn a deportation by saying the judge didn't balance the gravity of the offense versus the hardship to the person that would be caused by deportation. So I tend to think that legal strategies are likely to be more persuasive here than enforcement. But on the other hand, look, the criminal justice system has gone through remarkable changes in the last few years. I mean, the Innocence Project is all over the news. The mandatory sentence laws are now being voted down in state after state because of the cost, because of the harshness, because the data comes out that they don't really work. We may see similar things with deportation.
Can you talk a little bit about secure communities and how you think that has affected deportation?
Yeah. So does everybody know what secure communities is?
Go ahead.
Anybody not know? It's essentially a program that was started a couple of years ago I'll just put it really against the cooperation between local criminal law enforcement and federal immigration authorities. And as it was stated at first, you might have trouble thinking about what could possibly be wrong with that, because you'd say it is the law, and why should people be getting away with it? So it was a matter of merging databases and increasing cooperation. But it turns out that as it has actually been enforced, we're finding, again, very low-level offenders getting swept up because they're the low-hanging fruit. They're the ones who are easier to catch, and there they are. Even some people who are finding cases that are ending up being dismissed are getting then turned over to immigration. So it turns out that police are devoting a lot of their time and effort not at crime fighting so much, but at immigration-related things. So there's been a lot of criticism of it. In this state, the governor came out against it, although there was some back and forth. And that happened in some other states. The governors didn't want to cooperate. But the feds are still using it. They will go to individual county sheriffs. They say it's not up to the governor. Personally, I think there's been a lot of rallying cry about secure communities. I think people have not quite understood exactly what it was. I think there are bigger problems with the system than that, but that's a mechanism that organizers have tended to focus on. I don't think there's any chance that this administration is going to stop doing that. I mean, I think this administration has upped the number of criminal deportations dramatically. The Bush administration used to go in and raid factories, and they're not doing that anymore because that got a lot of criticism. But this secure communities is that mechanism of smart enforcement, so-called, where basically if you end up in the criminal justice system, you will end up in the deportation system.
Do you have a question?
Can I just ask simply, we're 5% of the world's population, 20% of the world's economy. We have huge incentive to want to come here. I think Pew estimated 150 million people would immigrate to the United States were possible. I'm a grandson of immigrants. My wife is an immigrant, went through her citizenship ceremony. What would you do with all of the people who are here illegally? Or what would you do to deter or dissuade them from coming? If, in a sense, we want to treat them humanely, how is that not a reward, in a sense, for flouting our immigration laws? I assume you agree we should have immigration laws.
Yeah.
What would you do to sort of enforce them?
Yeah, I think we have to break that question down into two components. So the first question is, what should we do with the people who are here? And as to them, it seems to me you first want to ask, what are the actual alternatives? So one alternative is we continue the status quo of a shadow population. That can't be good. That's not good for anybody's purposes, and it has nothing to do with enhancing the rule of law. So I think everybody could agree the status quo is unacceptable. So then we have two possible options. One is we could try to deport everybody. The other is we could come up with some sort of an earned legalization plan, or amnesty, whatever you want to call it. So the trying to deport everybody actually was costed out during the Bush administration. I have a little chapter about that in the book. It would cost hundreds of billions of dollars and require a police state to do it, because I can't tell by looking at anybody whether they're legal or illegal or documented or undocumented. So how would you enforce that? So I think that is not a possible option either. So then people say, all right, I don't support that, and I think nobody seriously supports that. Maybe we could make their lives so miserable that they'll voluntarily deport. That's enforcement by attrition. That's about the cruelest public policy I've ever heard of in my life. I mean, how do you identify them? How do you avoid discrimination against anybody who looks undocumented? And again, even the proponents of that are now shrinking. Mitt Romney at one point said he supported it, but I think now he's backing away from that too. So I think the reality is we have to find some way to integrate that population. Now that's not to say that they should be a complete amnesty. I mean, I think it's perfectly plausible to say people might have to pay a fine. There might be they could take it out of taxes over a period of time. They might have to wait in line over comparable groups in family categories. There are ways of, doing that. But I think we have to have some sort of an earned legalization plan. As to the other, I think we need to ask, who are the ones who are crossing the border? Predominantly Mexicans, Guatemalans, and other Central Americans. Why is that? it's because of economic factors in the American Southwest. It's because there are jobs. So the message they get from the United States is a mixed message. Come here, work for me, take care of my children, do my lawn. That's the one message they get. Or work in the factory or the meat packing plants or whatever. And the other is don't come here, it's illegal. We've got to solve the first part of that problem. We've got to solve the draw. And that is a matter of economics and a matter of maybe aid in the border regions around Mexico, maybe enforcement in the workplace, going forward, and maybe more border control if that's what we want to do. But I think we could regularize that labor path as had been done in the 19th century, actually. And that's part of the comprehensive bill that was proposed in 2007. Some sort of worker visa, so people could come here and work, and then they can go back to Mexico, which is actually what a lot of them want, because that's where their families are and their roots are. And if they bring some of that money back to Mexico that they earn, that will improve the Mexican and the Central American economy. I mean, it's a little idealistic, but I think we have to ask ourselves, what are the choices? I'm losing my head.
Yeah, I think everyone has
You
class
have
on one.
I was trying hard not to take it personally.
I know a couple people told me, but I have a couple more questions, and you guys need to leave the time, but, I mean, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting is the comparative arguments you were making, and one thing that I have heard is that, kind of a utilitarian argument for the American way, if you will, is that by having relatively lenient system for people, that you can be born here and get citizenship as compared to other countries, you don't see the same kind of perhaps alienation from culture that you might see in some of, say, Western European countries.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, people said that in the years after September 11th. Why is it that the UK has this massively alienated Pakistani population and we seem to be better able to integrate groups? I think there's a lot of reasons for it, but that's certainly one of them. The idea that you can, if your children are born here, they're Americans.
And in the UK, how is it?
They're not, there's no birthright citizenship. They can apply for citizenship, but they don't get it automatically. But I think there are other aspects of that nation of immigrants legacy. I mean, a lot of, let's say in particular Muslim immigrants, know that they might still face discrimination or a hard time when they come here. But they also know when they read their history books, somebody will say to them, the Irish faced the same thing. I mean, everybody hated the Irish when they came, or the Italians, or the Jews. I mean, every group has that story, and then they did become integrated. So there's a possible endgame that people can see.
But there's a critique to that story, which is that it has to also do with how quickly you can assimilate as white.
Well,
and so for certain communities, it's harder to make that assimilation.
Yes, it is harder. But, and again, I began the other book by saying that American history is often told as this optimistic, aspirational tale of struggle and toil and overcoming obstacles and then succeeding. And I don't buy into that story completely. And it's certainly harder for certain people than it is for others. But let's talk about Latinos. Let's talk about how incredible it is that just in the last 15 years, suddenly all the Republicans are saying we have to revise the whole Republican Party because we're never going to win an election again unless we start speaking to these people and not at them and not about them. And I think that's quite a remarkable transformation. And I think any immigrant group can look at that and say, well, if it's possible for them, it's possible for us. I mean, again, I get you on the critique, and I spend my life in the realm of critique. But if you're asking the question, how do I mean, I've spent enough time in Europe to compare. I think the social stratifications there and the ostracism are more profound than they are here. They just are. Now, maybe it's that we're not facing a stream of immigrants. I mean, the Latino immigrants are culturally and religiously actually quite a bit more similar to the Caucasian population in this country than are Muslim immigrants who are coming into Europe. So that's obviously a confounding factor. But even that, I still have this optimistic sense that the American ethos could assimilate those religious differences too, and does, better than the European model. Although, in terms of removal and deportation, I cite the European human rights model as something from which we could learn, some lessons about proportionality and so forth.
So it's harder to become a citizen but
it's harder to get
but
deported.
it's hard to get deported,
Yeah.
so sort of a larger gray category.
Yeah, yeah, it's like, I used to, what was the analogy, let me see if I can even remember this. Like, I think Michael Walzer used this metaphor also, of two universities, and one university you could think of like Harvard is actually very hard to get into, but I don't know what the grade inflation is like at the Kennedy School, but I know
Pretty high.
the law school pretty high. I mean, I had a professor at the law school, well, all right, I won't say because I know I'm being
You can edit it.
but let's say you have to work pretty hard to get a C or even a B around here. So once you're in, you're pretty good, you know. But there are other universities, like the big European universities, where basically anybody can get in, but only 20 or 30% are going to come out the other end with a degree, and everybody knows that. Those are two different models. So the United States, I tend to think, people think it's more like the Harvard model, but actually it isn't. It's actually now more like the European university model. Relatively easy to get into, but also relatively easy to get kicked out or to get washed out of.
In terms of the human rights aspect of just the deportation process and just holding without access to attorneys, or just how can we change it, and how is it even legal? I mean, think about trees that we have.
It's legal because the Supreme Court rendered a couple of decisions in the late 19th century against Chinese people, actually, where it said that deportation is a civil system, not a criminal system. So even though it feels like punishment to anybody who's experienced it, you don't have the rights of a criminal defendant.
But it's only targeting criminals.
Yes, but it's a collateral consequence. Now the Supreme Court just ruled in a very important case called Padilla versus Kentucky in 2010. The court recognized for the first time that the two systems are converging in such a way that one might well think that deportees should have some of the rights of criminal defendants when they face deportation, like maybe a right to counsel. The court didn't say this, I'm saying this. And I've been writing about this for 15 years, and others have. So I think courts are starting to look at that and think maybe we should revisit this doctrine. The Padilla case was specifically about whether a criminal defense lawyer has an obligation to advise her client about deportation consequences, because many states had a rule that you don't. So this guy had been told by his lawyer, take the plea, it doesn't matter, you won't get deported. And then it turned out the lawyer was wrong, and the plea was going to get him deported. So the question was, can you reopen that case? And the Supreme Court said, yeah, criminal lawyers have an obligation now. So I spend a lot of time training criminal lawyers now, and we have a lot of programs at the law school that converge the criminal with the immigration. And that was part of, in my mind, when I was saying litigation strategies actually make it more effective. But there's a long way to go. So the right to counsel, for example, was decided in criminal cases in a case called Gideon versus Wainwright, a famous Supreme Court case 40 years ago, 50. We don't have a case like that yet. So if you go into the JFK building, like I take my students to immigration court every year, I assign that. It's stunning what you will see. Do it, actually. You should just go and watch deportation proceedings. You'll see people leg shackled, hand shackled. You'll see people on video screens who have no lawyer, who have no idea what's going on, never even see the judge in person that sentences them to be deported. All kinds of things like that.
Just sort of begs the question, like you're focusing a lot now on like the retroactive, like you're interviewing people who have been deported. But do you think that the root of the problem really is, the laws and the proceedings? Like,
Yeah.
and do you think it can be stemmed from a different angle than just like interviewing people after that?
The best I've got is to write books, write op-eds, and try to litigate cases. If you have, I've worked with people in Congress. We tried to get a little law passed. We, meaning a partner at a firm in New York, who was a former BC law student before I got there, we're trying to get a special law passed just for the non-citizen relatives of the people who were killed on September 11th, which is a small group of people. Those relatives, but they were out of status, and like Dad went to work at the restaurant, and then nobody even found their bodies, but we know that there were some number of non-citizens, undocumented non-citizens. So we said, couldn't we at least get green cards for their children who were here, who've now been deprived of all possibility of support, who, by the way, were eligible for compensation from the fund, so that was a good thing, but then we're going to get deported. I mean, they'd have their money, but they could spend it in Guatemala or Mexico. Even that law turned out to be virtually, in fact, we still haven't gotten it passed, although it was supported by people like Sam Brownback. I mean, there were Republicans who supported it, but for complicated reasons. These laws are very difficult to get through the Congress. There's a lot of overlapping constituencies and a lot of strong feelings. So, and I'm more of a litigator type person, so I have faith that the legal system will eventually recognize the contradictions of this and will eventually make it right.
Did you ask that question with something else in mind?
No,
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the issue. I think it was fascinating what you said about the fact, I don't know how you actually said it, but anyway, Washington's word that those who are actually worthy of staying here can stay. Because it's really something that I also observed in Israel, but also in Europe, where I'm from. And in France, actually, they almost passed a law, the idea of which was actually double punishment, but not for illegal citizens, but for citizens who have been naturalized and who would be denaturalized. It didn't pass in the end, and it was, I mean, it's amazing. In Israel you have a law which can actually denaturalize, well, take the citizenship of a citizen if he has been disloyal to the state. And so I think it's really fascinating that you have those discourses all over the world. You know, that it's kind of way to actually reinforce the boundaries of your polity to say, yeah, you're good, you can stay, you're bad, you have to go out. And because you cannot do it on, well, of course, I guess those who are illegal or not totally legal or have green cards, of course, are more easily the victim of these processes. But it's not only them. Like as I say, in Israel, it's also citizens, and in France, the idea also emerged that naturalized people have that. But I was actually wondering something else. It was about.
Well, let me say one thing about that before you go to your question. One of the slides from Thomas Jefferson that I didn't show, that was his critique of the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were passed in this country in 1798 against French people mostly. But he said, forget about the French. Forget about whether we care about them or not. He said, if you allow the government to do this against the non-citizens, he said the friendless alien has been selected as the subject of an experiment, but the citizen will soon follow. You know, his argument was that these things have a way of moving, and I think that's what you're seeing in Europe, and you're seeing it here. Sorry, go ahead and ask another question.
Well, no, it's because I'm not very new in the US, and I was wondering how much meditatization you have on this kind of deportation, as you said, like in
militarization.
Meditation, like how much media attention you will have.
Oh, media. Oh.
Yeah.
New word.
A new word, okay. We use it.
I like it. It might catch on.
All right. So because in Belgium.
What is that in French?
Méditation.
That's a good word.
Because I know that in Belgium and France you have a lot of it when because we have awful stories of children turning like 18 and and the police come at the school and actually deport them right from the school to the airport and so you have like demonstration when that happens so that the police cannot enter the school, but then there is a lot of course of fuss about it and media attention. So I was wondering if in the US there was also something that the audience, that the American public was aware of.
For the dreamers, for the innocent ones, yes. But this is my criticism of the administration, because they're on the left of the spectrum. So if they are using this discourse of there are good people and bad people, and let's focus on the bad people. I mean, in Europe, I know that's not how people think about it. They look at it's more complicated reality. But here, I think there's been a lot of media about the undocumented, and people. One guy wrote a piece in the New York Times Magazine about a year ago saying it was like coming out of the closet. It was like being gay and saying you're gay. To suddenly say I'm undocumented, it was so traumatic, and it is. I don't trivialize it. But this other group, the criminal deportees, very little media coverage, very little. And I write these books. I mean, if I sell 500 books, it's a good year. So there's not a lot of. I mean, we just keep writing about it and hoping that it'll grip the attention, but not so much yet. I mean, some, but not much. By the way, there is a very good film. If you want to see a media treatment of it, There's a film called A Sentence Home that was made about 5 years ago, and it's about the Cambodians. It's really good. You can get it. There's two versions. There's a short version that's about 70 minutes. There's a longer version that's about 110 minutes. If you get it on Amazon or something, get the longer version because there's a lot of good stuff in there. I show it to my students every year. It's quite good. And not sentimental. I mean, it shows some of the complexities of this. I mean, one of the guys who was deported was a real, he was a gang member. He had done some bad things. So it's not, I'm not saying they're all innocent victims. There are some people who are bad. But they served their time, and then the question is, what do we do next?
So, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, you talked about the trend lines and all these things being related to, more people of color coming to the United States, and it just sort of makes me wonder, like, what's the rationale behind these deportations? It's not, obviously based on the data at least, if Americans are committing more crimes per capita.
But these data are just recent. I mean, when the laws were passed, it was all about crime control and terrorism and fear, and that's why my first slide is that quote, "Fear is the parent of cruelty." I think a lot of this comes from fear. It's that fear of the other. It's that swarthy foreigner that we don't trust. And when these laws were passed in Congress, it was all about criminal aliens. And, you read the testimony; it's quite striking. And they would come up with a few horror stories, and that was it before the sociologists caught up with it.
But isn't it an effective deterrent to future illegal immigration if you, in a sense, face the fear of being deported once you arrive? I mean, one could argue that the lower incidence of crime among illegal immigrants it might be a function of the fear that you consider a bad thing. One could say once their children arrive and they're no longer afraid of being deported, they're more apt to commit the same crime. So you can look at the same data.
It's true, but ironically, I think that fear actually would explain low rates of criminality among the undocumented people, because it's the extended border control form of deportation. Whether the post-entry social control form of deportation really affects conduct seems to me much more problematic, because most of those people already have green cards, they're already legal, and in my experience at least, they're not thinking about this at all. Now you may say, of course, I go talk to church groups, there are young people there, I say, do not smoke marijuana, do not, you got to really be careful. So maybe it does have some deterrent effect. That's hard to measure.
Well, to me, it seems like the only rational one, because if it's fear of the other or fear of people of color, we get, as you mentioned, 1 million people here every year, legally. They're not coming from Western Europe. In fact, they're coming primarily from Asia, right? 95%. Whereas 60...
No, not 95%. Were you talking about the legal immigration?
Million new immigrants that follow the procedures. That's a number I read. I read that, and that 68% of the illegal immigrants are coming from Mexico and points south of Central and South America. So
that sounds low too, actually. I would think.
Well, they're not coming from Western Europe, so wherever they're coming from,
I think
the people who are here legally are of color, and the people who are here illegally are of color. It seems to me kind of an odd argument to make it sort of anti people of color when in a sense we're embracing some that are of color and others that aren't.
Well, except in prior historical periods of large immigration, we didn't have this deportation mechanism at all, and those were during times when there were virtually no people of color immigrating here. So looking at it comparatively, historically,
fair enough, but it's a big continent, and it's, might have not been feasible.
Well, that's a good point too. Actually, deportation was difficult, and it may be that had it been easier. Actually, I was on a panel with a guy who wrote a very interesting article. His name is Ethan Blue. He's an Australian, about how the rise of the railroad system actually facilitated the rise of the deportation system, because they used to do these trains all over the country where they could pick people up and then put them to the port, so it became easier to do. So that could explain some of it, although the first deportation laws come about in regard to the Chinese specifically. In fact, only apply to the Chinese up until the 20th century, and then it starts picking up steam. I mean, we should have a conference about this, because there's a lot of factors, and I'm certainly not suggesting that this is a simple reality, or that the proponents of these laws were necessarily racist. But I do think that there's a way in which it's easier for majority populations to conceptualize harsh laws when they tend to apply to minority populations and not to their children, or not to people who look like them or their ancestors. And I would say in Boston, when Irish people started getting deported in larger numbers, I started seeing a lot more reaction against it among the children of immigrants themselves. So I think there's sort of a natural human tendency to empathize more with groups that you feel more in common with. I think what's happening now with the Latino population is that little by little, Anglo-Americans are getting used to the idea of that population as Americans, and maybe are becoming more sympathetic to some of the concerns that they've had about deportation. But I can't prove it, but it's just a feeling. I don't know. I mean, if you were to make the argument that there's no racial component to this, I think there are problematic aspects to that in light of again, the criminal justice system and the composition of the young men who have been disenfranchised and so forth. It is a striking racial disparity in who has faced certain types of sanctions, even though, as you say, the incoming stream is also mostly people of color. I mean, that's true too. That's why I said it's a dual reality, and what we're trying to assess, what I'm trying to assess, is the ratio, is the relationship between the generous nation of immigrants impulse and the exclusionary impulse, and then questioning why in an era of immigration of mostly people of color has the ratio tipped so much. That's the research question.
But yeah, just jumping on that, I think it's interesting because I have also the feeling that sometimes the racial prism is also actually like shaped by laws and by institutions. I'm thinking about Europe before the extension to like the integration of East European countries. There was very strong racism against Polish, against Romanian, and now that they are in Europe, the racism has gone outside of the borders of Europe. So I have the feeling that it's not like a natural racism. It's also something that is institutionalized. A kind of a way of seeing the other is totally.
Yeah, everybody wants somebody to focus their awareness on. There's a great episode of The Simpsons about this that I showed in my class. That starts out with a community that has a problem with bears eating their garbage. And so they start demonstrating, say, we're here, we're clear, we don't want any more bears, and they're all demonstrating against the bears. But then it quickly turns into an anti-immigrant movement after they deal with the bear problem. They start focusing on Apu and the 7-Eleven.
Actually, last year I was working in France teaching English, and there were a lot of demonstrations against, there were a lot of deportations of the Roma population, forcible. People took videos on their phones of these really violent deportation scenes that were just horrific to witness. I mean, we do it maybe. I'm not sure these raids that you talked about, meat factors and so on, that we do that as well. But it seems like, for some reason, in France it got a lot more attention.
Well, the Roma are a particularly difficult population because they have strong cultural cohesion. They tend it's like what, I wouldn't want to overstate the analogy, but it's like what people used to say about the Jews in Poland. They keep to themselves, they don't want to assimilate, they speak a different language, they have these weird traditions. When you have a relatively insular population that actually is not that interested in integrating, maybe that gets back to your question as well. The Latino population in this country is very interested in integrating for the most part. I mean, they really want to be part of it. That's why I think all this debate about English only is stupid. I've never met a Latino family, and I speak Spanish, and I've talked to a lot of, I haven't met a single one who ever said to their children, don't learn English. I mean, it's ridiculous. They know that that's the pathway. The Roma, I have the impression, and maybe this is wrong because I haven't studied it much, maybe they're not as insular as I think. That may be a
don't go to
racist
school,
observation.
usually children never don't go to school.
Yeah, I mean, that's my sense.
That's the first problem,
Yeah.
I think. And also I think it's like kind of those who were not integrated because they're not European, well, they're the outsiders, and they're not French, they have usually a Romanian passport, but even in Romania they're not integrated because they're the outsider, because they have another religion.
Yeah.
And so, and they're moving, they don't have the same way of living as the other West European people, and so they remain like the kind of those who are not accepted, and and don't want to accept the way of life in France, and so it's it's reinforced itself. And but it's interesting too, because actually as you say, you have very violent action against them, but then you have very powerful demonstration in favor of Roma integration and against the deportation. So it's interesting too, the kind of dynamics that it actually produces in Europe. It's always like violent clashes, but like the best is also coming out of it sometimes. It's yeah.
So we probably I have one last question, which I don't know if you can answer in a couple of minutes, but I found this new American diaspora quite provocative.
Good.
And
Provocative is good.
And in part because in really thinking about, kind of going back to your approach, right, how do you translate some of these ideas into policy? You were saying you're pushing for kind of recognition on the international scene of deportees. I mean, it seems to me that this is really a continuum.
Yeah.
So you've got people on the one hand who are very, from the new American diaspora, came when they were babies, seem very American, but then you've also got people who are, the workers in Guatemala that you're saying have hired the coyote to bring them across the border again, and to me that actually seems like a huge spectrum of people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's true. Diaspora is a very imprecise term, and I don't actually tend to think of the Guatemalans as the diaspora group. I'm talking about the long-term, typically lawful residents who have grown up here, who come here as children, of which there are some Guatemalans among the dreamers.
So the social conduct.
I mean, I'm just saying the category of deportees is bigger. The diaspora is a subset of the deportees. But I think your question, to my mind, prompts the importance of a nuanced idea of the rule of law to address this problem. Part of what's the problem since the 90s is that we have a very binary system. So you're either in the category, in which case you're deported, banished for life, and have no defenses, or you're outside the category. My client, Edna, was an aggravated felon, which is a category that includes murderers and rapists. So how could petty larceny be an aggravated felony? Because the law says a theft offense with a 1-year sentence, even if it's suspended, and I don't think many in Congress intended that, but that's what it says, is an aggravated felony. So that's pretty harsh. So I'm advocating for bringing back some ideas of discretion, mercy maybe, but certainly proportionality into the law, and that's what we've abandoned over the course of the last 20 years. So I think the idea of proportionality actually implements the idea of diaspora, because you have a judge who then has to take into account a variety of factors. How deep is your connection to this country? Who are your children? And that is being done in Europe. So if you tend to think that's too, amorphous, I mean, it happens in courts around the world all the time. It just doesn't happen here.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Daniel Kanstroom for a great, really, really great talk.